Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our community conversation on the DC cat count. We're just going to give it a couple more minutes to allow people to trickle in. Okay, I think we can go ahead and get started. Good afternoon. Welcome to the community conversation on the DC cat count. We've been really excited to get together with everyone and have this conversation now that we're at this stage of the project. I'm Risa Courier. I'm the Vice President of External Affairs for the Humane Rescue Alliance. We are based in Washington, D.C. Many of you already know about the DC cat count and have followed along with this project for the last 3 years, but for some of you, this may be the first time you've heard of this project. So as a little bit of background, the DC cat count was launched 3 years ago as a unique collaboration between animal welfare organizations and wildlife scientists to identify the number of cats in the Washington, D.C. region. It is the most comprehensive cat census ever undertaken, and we counted cats who live outdoors, indoors, and those who have transited through our animal shelter system, which we operate at the Humane Rescue Alliance here in DC. So the goal of the project is to develop humane, data-driven population management programs in communities across the nation, with the DC cat count serving as a model. The count was organized and led by the Humane Rescue Alliance, the Humane Society of the United States, the ASPCA, PetSmart's charity, and the Smithsonian Conservation Biology Institute. So I'm really excited to be joined by some of the folks that made this project possible. First, I'll introduce our two science leads. And that's Dr. Tyler Flockhart, University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science, Dr. John Boone, Research Director from the Great Basin Observatory in Reno, Nevada. And he also is a biostatistical consultant with Humane Society of the United States and their affiliate, Humane Society International. And then we have Dr. Margaret Slater, DVM, PhD, who serves as a Senior Director for Research at the ASPCA. And then Danielle Bays, who's the Senior Analyst, Cat Protection and Policy at the Humane Society of the United States. And last but not least, Chris Schendler, VP of Field Services at the Humane Rescue Alliance. So welcome to all of you, and thank you for taking times out of your busy schedules to talk about this exciting collaboration. So I think we'll just dive in at the deep end and start talking about why we all came together for this project, to work on this project in the first place. And so John, I will start with you. This project is really unusual, not only because it's so comprehensive, but it also includes an unusual partnership between wildlife scientists and animal welfare organizations working collaboratively together towards a common goal. So can you talk to us about why cat communities are so controversial, and how this project is an important first step in towards better management of cat communities and also a better, healthier approach to the cat wildlife debate.
Sure thing, Risa. Thank you, and welcome to everybody. I think it's fair to say that the community cat debate was the kind of the precipitating reality behind this project. And you've got a situation where you've got two constituencies that feel very strongly, very passionately about the mission that they're pursuing. You've got conservationists who see the natural world under assault in all sorts of ways and perceive cats to be a part of that assault. You've got animal welfare folks who know how hard life, firsthand, how hard life can be for unowned outdoor cats and don't want to make that life any harder. And these two groups can sometimes perceive the position of the other group as a threat to this mission that they feel so strongly about. So this is a recipe for a potential conflict. But what has made this debate even worse, I think, and something that I think our whole project team, a perspective that our whole project team sort of shares, is that there's been a notable holes in our knowledge about the nature of this issue that we face. In most places, we really don't know how many community cats there really are. We don't know how they're distributed over the landscape. We know that some cats prey on wildlife, but we really don't know what the ecological impacts of those predation events are in different kinds of areas for the most part. We make anecdotal observations about what kind of management seems to be working or isn't working, but that's rarely measured in objective terms. So we have all of these information gaps, and what happens when you combine information gaps with passionate opinions? Those passionate opinions start to fill the void that the information would otherwise be creating, and groups tend to emphasize interpretations of the world that they're predisposed to believe, and we end up with a debate that's characterized by these sort of blanket statements like TNR works and nothing else does, or TNR never works, it can't possibly work. And all of those answers are really too simple, and they sort of get in the way of effective problem solving, I think, sometimes. So the rationale behind this project was that we needed to help introduce into this debate some mechanisms by which to fill that information gap, and at the same time try to set an example of how these two constituencies could actually focus on some shared goals and start working together to achieve those goals. And the goal that we focused on was to try to make Washington D.C. basically a laboratory for trying out, investigating, optimizing different ways to fill this information gap by counting cats. And then probably the most important part of the whole thing was to seek to share that knowledge more widely, which is where the larger impacts will occur when these tools for filling these information gaps become more widely used. So that's my take on the outdoor cat debate, and why we think and hope that this project sort of stakes out a preferable way forward.
Thanks, John. And hopefully one of the results and impacts of this project is we'll see more collaborative efforts between wildlife scientists and experts, and also those in the animal welfare cat protection space. Danielle, coming from that as a cat protection advocate, do you have anything to add to that in terms of why you were interested in this project and how this collaboration has worked?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you everyone for joining us. I'm super excited about this project. I actually started my animal welfare career doing wildlife advocacy, and then somehow became a community cat advocate. Life brings you different experiences. So, but I see that there's a lot more common ground between the cat people and the bird people, the wildlife people, than is often often recognized. And a lot of times, the media doesn't help this. They want to create that divide when you actually are talking to people on the ground, that we all really want to see the same thing. We want to see fewer cats outside. We want to have resources so that those cats aren't ending up outside. But really this overlap, and coming from an organization, Humane Society of the United States, we have both cat advocacy and wildlife programs in particular focused on human wildlife conflict, which is a lot of similarities to the cat wildlife conflict debate and some of the ways that are used to address that. And there's just so much that we can learn from each other. But what I see in the community cat world is people wanting more tools. They want more resources. They want to know how to do this better. And like John said, like TNR works, and like we don't even know what that means. So TNR is a tool, and how you utilize that tool can be different. So how do we know how we're using it and what our impact is? And these are the kind of things that I'm hearing from people across the country running programs at shelters or independent groups, that people want these kind of resources. So I'm really super excited that we've been able to bring these knowledge bases together, and that we can learn from this, hopefully continue to collaborate, expand our collaboration, and really make some significant impact for both cats and for wildlife.
Absolutely. So you both said something about how oftentimes positions are not informed by data, but more of our anecdotal observations. And a big part of that is creating this data set and creating an opportunity to have data-driven decisions. And so Margaret, I'd like to talk to you about this. This is your area of expertise. And there has been a shift in animal welfare, a welcome shift towards science-based assessments of animal shelter programs, especially the population management programs. Can you speak to why gathering this type of data is so important to policy and population management decisions?
Risa, and it's really great to be here with such a huge group of interested people. The ASPCA was really excited when we saw this project because of all of the data gaps and anecdotal experiences that you've already heard about from John and Danielle. And animal welfare has been pushing towards being more data-driven. It's something that many of us have been talking about for many years. I think in large part because of the recognition that there's limited resources, and we want to know where should we put them, and when we put them there, are they doing what we hope? So that's a big driver for this. For the community cat piece particularly, it's really important because while there's community cats in many, many locations, what's going on locally in your community or your neighborhood might not be the same thing that's going on in the next neighborhood or in a different community. And certainly there's regional differences based on climates and resources for the cats. So getting those local insights is going to be invaluable for your planning and understanding of what the issues are. And then that also helps you figure out who you might want to partner with and how you might want to engage others in the community, because it's now you have data about your community, and that can be really exciting for other folks. It's also really helpful to find that common ground. When your project is here's about how many cats we think there are, or here's what our goals are, and we're going to measure those goals in a reliable and valid way and look at data and numbers, it's much easier to get people to have a reasonable and rational conversation about what's going on, because you will define what you're doing and where you're going and how you're going to get there. And finally, I think having data and being data-driven really helps us learn from each other. So part of what the DC Cat Count tools are going to be is having people use them and then being able to share those experiences. What worked, what didn't work, why did it work? What was really helpful in engaging the community or in counting cats or in getting people to do the cat counting or any of those things. And if you don't have data and you're not tracking what you're doing in a fairly structured way, you're not going to be able to share with other people what you've learned and how best to do it. So there's a lot of different reasons for this. But I think it really builds on what we've already been doing in the animal welfare space and what the wildlife folk have been doing for a very long time in terms of using data to try and be thoughtful about where you're going to go and whether you've gotten there.
Thank you, Margaret. So let's go ahead and start talking about the project design of the DC cat count. So the DC cat count's innovative approach to studying all segments of the cat population has created a next generation in how we understand and manage outdoor cats, both owned and unowned. The data sets include household surveys, shelter records, and camera traps. So Tyler, can you walk us through how you gathered the data from each of these distinct cat populations?
Sure, thanks, Risa, and thank you everybody for being here today. I'm wondering if we could bring up the slides that we have, because I really want to show sort of a schematic of how we need to think about the cat population in DC. So this is slide 3, Risa, if you could bring that up, or maybe I could bring that up, I'm not sure.
I've got it up, Tyler. I'm happy to do it. I can do it fast.
Sure, if you can share your screen, that'd be great. So
Share
the reason why I wanted to bring
screen.
up this schematic is because when we think about cats in our community, there's a lot of different types of cats, right? We have cats that are outside, we have cats that are inside, we have cats that are in the shelter system, and we have cats that may fit one or more of these categories, right? So this schematic on the right-hand side, I think is really, in my mind, this was sort of the feature that made me really interested in this topic, because we have, in our minds, 3 sort of subpopulations of cats. So at the top with the fence, those are outdoor cats. The bottom left, we have owned indoor cats, and the bottom right, we have what we would sort of say as shelter cats. And as a scientist, studying these subpopulations is really interesting. But as a conservation scientist and someone that's interested in cat management, I'm really interested also in the arrows between those subpopulations, because there's cats that move between these different categories through human interventions. And those human interventions are the tools that was mentioned before. But to study each one of these subpopulations, we need to do it in a different way. We need to collect different data. So for the cats that are outside, we did that by using camera trap surveys. And camera trap surveys are basically remote censored cameras that are set up in the community, and they take pictures of cats and other critters as they go in front of the camera. And this is done in wildlife ecology all the time to photograph things like Bengal tigers and what have you. But in our case, we're talking about the little Bengal tigers in our neighborhoods. The bottom left are the owned cats, or those that have care from caregivers. And to do that, we interview people at the household level and ask them, how many cats do you own? What type of outdoor access do these cats have? What type of care do you provide? Those types of things. What are your attitudes and perceptions? And then the bottom right, of course, is the shelter. And really, Washington, D.C. was, I think, the best place to do this type of work, because there's one animal shelter that works for the entire district, and that's HRA. So we could confidently say that we would have a good or a true count of the number of cats that move through the shelter system. So that's sort of how we would collect these data for these different subpopulations. And then, of course, we would use these data to understand these arrows between them and how the cats move between them, to understand on a holistic scale the cat population in Washington, D.C.
Great, thank you, Tyler. John, did you have anything to add on how we designed the DC cat count project and
Yeah,
seeing the data?
I just add a word or two about outdoor cats. Tyler mentioned the camera surveys that we did, but we recognize that that camera surveys are a fairly labor-intensive process, and so we concurrently investigated other ways to count outdoor cats, specifically transect counts, which maybe a few of our participants have engaged in some of these before, but it's basically a process where you walk predetermined routes in the city and count the cats that you see. And one of our questions was how well this simpler method could provide useful information. And I think we may be talking about that a little bit later. But there was also this layer of this sort of practical consideration that was layered on top of the more holistic system level data collection.
Okay, thanks, Sean. So before we launch into the cat counting toolkit, which is we're really excited to share, Tyler, would you be able to just go over some of the findings from all of this 3 years of data collection, and what can you tell us about DC cats? Where do they live? And what do we know about these different populations?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for bringing up the maps here, John. So I thought what I would do is sort of walk through a series of maps of Washington, D.C. that sort of visually display the data and the results from the project that we conducted. So we'll start with outdoor cats. And this map looks at the occupancy probability. So that is, what's the probability that within any small area within Washington, D.C., there are outdoor cats? And so this probability ranges between 0 and 1, which means there's a 0% chance and there's a 100% chance that a cat occurs there. And this is based off of several different landscape features. So things like, what's the development type in the area? What's the housing density in the area? And what are some of the socioeconomics in the area? And when we have a look at this map, we can see that a couple of patterns pop out. The first is that the areas in white, there's a few of them across the district. These are areas that have a very low probability of cats, and these are natural areas in Washington, D.C. So you can see the natural area sort of in the northern part of D.C. There are very few cats in that natural area. When you look at areas with high housing density, and especially in lower economic areas, lower socioeconomic areas, you have a higher probability of there being cats there. So these are general patterns that we can determine from the data. And this is really important. It gives us two pieces of information. One is that socioeconomics is a very good predictor of the probability of outdoor cats. And the second is that the probability of there being outdoor cats in natural areas, at least in Washington, D.C., is really, really low. Can we go to the next slide, please, John? So when we take those same camera data and we use it to estimate the number of free roaming cats in Washington, D.C., and we look at that across the district, we get an estimate of about 6,500 free roaming cats. And again, if we look at the map and we look at the density of cats, so this is the number of cats per hectare, and a hectare is 100 meters by 100 meters or 300 feet by 300 feet. We can see that it ranges between 0 and approximately 1 cat per hectare. And again, we can see this sort of gradient pattern as we go from the southeast to the northwest of higher cat densities in the south and lower cat densities in the north. And again, these patterns are again predicted by land use patterns, socioeconomic indicators, and housing density as well. Now, it's important to recognize that camera traps are photographing all cats that are outside. But we probably have sort of two buckets of cats that are outside. We have cats that are owned by people that may be indoor-outdoor cats. Those cats are likely to be outdoors during the day and probably are outside during seasonal periods compared to winter periods, generally. The other bucket of cats are cats that are outdoors all the time. So these may be stray cats, these may be feral cats, but we suspect that there's probably fewer feral and stray cats outdoors compared to indoor-outdoor cats. And looking at these data and with the folks at the Smithsonian Institute, we suspect that the camera traps are probably capturing these free-roaming and feral cats more often than they're capturing indoor-outdoor cats. And that is likely to do with behavior differences between those groups. The stray and feral cats are likely moving further and are more likely to be photographed by cameras, compared to indoor-outdoor cats, which more than likely are moving very small distances when they are outside. So I only mention that now because we're going to get to another estimate of indoor-outdoor cats in a couple of slides. Next slide, please, John. Okay, so this is information from the household survey that questioned households about cat ownership and outdoor access. So when we ask people whether they own cats and how many cats they own, and then look at the predictors of those, we find patterns that suggest that cat ownership is dependent upon education level. Sort of the higher education level you have, the more likely you are to own cats, and also age. But this is sort of a curved relationship where it's highest for people in their 40s to own cats. Now, it's lower for younger people and for older people. Now, when it comes to household income, we actually find the curve goes the other direction, where it's lowest for the middle income people, and it is highest for low and high income people. So when you think about those two things together, they may be actually canceling each other out a little bit. So you have people in their 40s that are more likely to own cats, but of course, people in their 40s are probably in the middle income bracket, right? They're sort of in that working stage of their life. So that sort of brings these curves together a little bit. But using that type of information, what we can do is we can estimate the number of cats per household across the district, which is the map that you see on the right. And we can see that there's a wide range of cats in households, but generally people that are in low developed areas, these are areas with low housing density and high median incomes, actually have a higher number of cats per household than other areas. And what's important about this map is that once we have a map like this, we can multiply it by the number of households across Washington, D.C. to get an estimate of the true number of cats that are owned by people. So if we go to the next slide, John. So this is the estimate of the total number of owned cats. So on the right-hand side, this is sort of a heat map of the number of cats and where they are distributed in Washington, D.C. And not surprisingly, this map probably looks fairly similar to a map of housing density in Washington, D.C. And that makes sense. But when we take that information and we estimate the number of cats across the whole district, we end up with about 197,000 owned cats across Washington, D.C. And of those owned cats, about 53% of them are indoors at all periods, and about 47% of them have some or complete outdoor access. So when you look at these numbers, we're talking about half of all the owned cats have outdoor access to some extent. Okay, John, can you flip to the next one? Okay, the next analysis has to do with shelter data. So these have to do with intake and outcome records into HRA. So when we look at intakes, they tend to come from the central and the southeast portion of the district. And John, if you flip to the next one, when you look at outcomes, the pattern shifts a little bit. So we have higher outcomes in the central and sort of the northwestern portion of the district. So these are counts of the number of cats per year that are coming in and going out of the shelter. But what we're really interested in here is the difference between these two values. And we want to identify the areas where the cats are coming from and where the cats are going to. And basically what this will show us is this movement of cats within the district that happens through the shelter system. So John, if you can go to the next slide. When we look at the difference between these two intakes and outcomes, we classify it as a source area or a sink area. Source areas are the sources of where the cats are coming from that go to HRA, and sink areas are the areas where those cats go to mainly through adoption. And as you can see, there's this stark contrast between the cats coming from the eastern and southeastern portion of the district, and they are going to the central and the northwestern portion of the district. So in my mind, this provides really strong information about the role of HRA and the movement of cats. And I'm really interested to sort of understand, what does that mean when it comes to things like, how do we figure out the best way to manage cat populations when we have this movement of cats going across the district? And I think that's the last data slide. Yeah.
Thank you, Tyler. This research obviously has incredible implications for how we manage cats and where we provide and distribute services, but also for wildlife. HRA is the only animal sheltering organization in the district, Tyler, as you pointed out, which makes this a wonderful laboratory for understanding these concepts. But we're charged with caring for for community cats and also with wildlife. So Chris, could you talk about how you see this data informing our programs at the Humane Rescue Alliance?
Yeah, thank you, Risa, and thank you everyone for joining today. As Risa said, we provide these services in the field, and I oversee our field services department, which is where we have officers 24 hours a day, 7 days a week that work on not only companion animal issues and community cats and wildlife, but also investigate animal cruelty and a host of other programs we provide in the field. And I think this research will really help us to better understand where cats live and also to assist us with being more strategic where we can place resources, that will, provide safety for both wildlife and community cats. I think we all want to continue to be more strategic in our work, and I think this data set and this research will help us do that.
Thanks so much, Chris. So without further ado, we will get to the cat counting toolkit. One of the most important products of this 3-year project is the creation of this toolkit, which really consolidates everything that we learned during this project, and also consolidating it into simple, effective tools so that other organizations can directly do their own projects. So the toolkit's designed to be accessible for individuals and organizations with any level of technical experience, and applicable to projects that range from simple transects to more complex camera traps. So not everyone has to do the gold standard, which we've established through the DC cat count. And we certainly don't want anyone to feel intimidated that they have to do a project of this scope and level. So John, would you be able to walk us through just the introductory chapters of the toolkit on design, on project management and design?
Sure thing. I'm gonna share a screen again. And I would like to, before we launch right in, I'd like to just re-emphasize a couple of the things Risa said. One of the questions that have come our way most often that I think represents perhaps a little bit of a misconception about the project is people say, oh yeah, that's all well and good, but we can't do what you did in Washington in our area. And it was never anybody's thought or intention that you should do what we did in Washington in your area. Washington, as I mentioned earlier, it was meant to be a laboratory to test these different techniques and find out which work well, which don't work so well, and distill that into resources and advice and guidance that a wide variety of different users could potentially find beneficial as a way to incorporate cat counting into their program at whatever level it makes sense to do so, either logistically or in terms of your goals or in terms of your technical expertise and appetite. So the toolkit really is in many ways the central outcome of this project, and it's designed to be accessible to again, a wide variety of different user groups. So we've structured that into several different chapters that are organized into different categories. And we start out, as you see illustrated here, with an introduction to cat counting, which goes through in very brief and very accessible form a lot of critical concepts that will sort of get you tuned into the toolkit and how it might be useful to you. We've created what we call a roadmap, which you can investigate in conjunction with that introduction to try to understand which of the sections or chapters that you see listed here might be the ones that you want to pay special attention to. And then there's some, I guess we call them foundational chapters to the toolkit that are going to be useful to a wide array of users. And those include chapters describing how important it is to set clear, measurable goals, what the different types of goals are, how to determine whether or not you want to pursue your goals and your project in a coalition framework or not, and if so, some tips for how to do that effectively. A little bit of a background on this whole issue of cat populations and why we keep stressing the word population, because we are in essence trying to manage populations, even though our experience and our mindset is often kind of more connected to the individual cat. So there's a chapter that sort of helps you link this concept of the welfare of individual animals to managing populations of these animals, and how you create the right kind of metrics to do that. And then an important chapter about considering whether there are ethical ramifications to the work that you're planning to do and how to navigate that successfully. So I believe the intention here is to have others talk about some of the subsequent parts of the toolkit. So I'll advance the slide and turn it over to them. But I do want to emphasize that for those of you listening, I'd really encourage you to at least read that introduction to cat counting. I think it will give you a good window into the role we hope this toolkit will play. And with that, Risa, I'll advance the slide to these next sections and whoever is going to present those.
Sure. Thanks so much, Sean. I'll just put it out there for Margaret or Danielle. Do either you both have a deep history with doing these kinds of cat counting projects? And then is there anything that came about or that you learned through the DC cat count that informed the toolkit and that helped tailor some of the project management and design tools for other organizations, no matter what scope of project they have?
I'd like to answer that before we
Okay, we'll go for it.
To me, the biggest challenge with creating a toolkit is to recognize that we have a set of information, and some of it's for the right kind of user. It can get into a lot of technical depth and detail, but there's also a large, interested, important user group that may not want to get into that level of technical detail. So we wanted to try to make this toolkit, more than anything else, feel like it's a practical resource, that you can find something in it that makes sense for your project and helps you get started using cat counting to inform your project and make it more effective. And I think speaking from my own impression is that I think we've done a pretty good job of trying to make all of this information, a lot of which will be somewhat novel to readers, accessible, and even, dare I say, interesting. So,
well, it is definitely interesting. There's no question. Margaret, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I'd like to just reiterate that sections of this really are usable for most folks. We used some of it for a very simple set of transect counts in one small location. The toolkit wasn't up yet, so we needed to get it downloaded from John's brain. But it was a really nice opportunity for us to see what the community was like, for us to engage volunteers. And the count itself is, once you've designed the walking paths and your protocols, is really, seems kind of low tech in some ways. I mean, we took pictures of cats and put them in the phone and did all of that. But then it's a little Excel spreadsheet that says, okay, here's how many cats we found when we counted in February and how many we found when we counted in August. And lo and behold, there were more cats visible in August, and there were a lot more kittens in August. I do think that the most important piece in some ways is figuring out what the right goal is for your work. So, for example, for this piece, we were interested in being able to talk about we really wanted to get in there and do a lot of spay and neuter. And we wanted to be able to show that there was a very high proportion after a year or two of cats who were ear tipped and a very small proportion of kittens, none or very small. And that was our goal. And so we were able to we are in the process of using the transect walks to be able to understand what the proportion of ear tipped cats is and is not, how best to spot your tipped cats, which is something that we've had to dig into with a telephoto lens in some cases, and thinking about it. And many people who are involved in community cats have very different goals. Our goal to get a very high percentage of these cats spayed and neutered was because we believed that if we did that, there would be much less need for the stray cats and the little kittens to end up in the shelter. And that was the goal for this specific location, was if they're all altered, they're going to be better looked after. There's not going to be litters of kittens that are going to need to go somewhere, and they won't end up in the shelter. But many people have other goals, and thinking about those really explicitly, that's why there's a whole section here on that, is really important, because that drives all of the data that you're going to collect and all of the actions that you're going to take.
Thank you, Margaret. Danielle, did you want to chime in on anything?
I just want to point out that we made this toolkit to be very accessible to people. One of my coworkers, Vicky Stevens, did some copy editing on this and hadn't been involved with the project, but having it reviewed by people who weren't involved to ask those questions. What does this mean? I'm a layperson. So we took the time to do that, and our team is very good at teaching and educating with this. So it's not meant to be only for people with a certain skill level or to have a certain experience. It really provides the whole background you need, and step by step to go through, develop a program, figuring out what parts you can use and what parts you might not, because we recognize that a lot of the people who we would like to be implementing this don't have necessarily a lot of resources or time, are busy, maybe they're volunteering, but they can find some aspect of this that they can find of value today. And maybe with the success of that, can go back and utilize more of the different sections of the toolkit, and expand their data collection and analysis and monitoring work, to keep continuing to grow and improve their efforts for cats and for wildlife.
And Risa, let me just walk folks through these last couple of slides that introduces the whole toolkit. There's a couple of sections that deal with the more technical issues that you see here, sampling and data analysis. And I'd encourage people to read those as well, because the goal of these is not to turn you into a statistician, but to enable you, if the occasion arises, to have a productive discussion with somebody who has that background and those skills. So you might find that useful. And then, of course, there are sections about all of these different ways of specifically counting cats that we've touched on when Tyler presented information, as you see right here. So that's how we've got the toolkit basically organized.
Thank you. So one thing that the toolkit also provides support on is the analytics. So we know that data is only as effective as the analytics. So Tyler, maybe you could talk to us a little bit about the interpretation and application of these outcomes and how to identify community partners that have the expertise that could help individuals wanting to undertake their own cat counting project apply the outcomes.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, so I think that this is a really important thing to consider in any type of program, right? People often think, I'm going to collect some information, I'm going to collect some data, and it's going to show me something. And that's the whole goal. But there's a really slippery slope between having the data and being able to analyze that data properly and make correct inference from that data. And I think that one of the central things that we thought about when we were considering how to provide this to other organizations through the toolkit is, how do we make that connection between people that will be collecting the data and people that might be used to analyze that data to draw conclusions from it. And so there's sections in the toolkit about how to find a data analyst, where you can look, and the type of conversations that you might want to have with them. And the toolkit provides a really nice overview so that you can have sort of intelligent conversations with these folks without having to get into the gritty details of the statistics. And so we've suggested that a couple places you might look is within your organization. You may have volunteers that have certain skills, mapping skills, maybe they have statistical analysis skills, maybe they have programming skills. So you can maybe lean on that volunteer base to see if people have those skills. And quite often, if people have those skills, they love applying them in things that they're passionate about. Another opportunity may be looking at if there are local or regional universities or community colleges that have people that are interested in especially ecology, biology, or veterinary science. I think that that's another good place to look. Another opportunity is through animal shelters or through organizations. And my background is in ecology, and I think that if you sent an email to the Ecology Society of the United States and said, this is what I'm interested in doing, do you have any recommendations of folks in my area? They would be able to come back and say, here's a list of people in your area that are a part of our organization that you could contact about this topic, right? I mean, that's the whole idea of having these professional organizations, is that they know where the people are, right? And so they can do that quite quickly. And I think that that's a good place to start, because it may take a few conversations or a few leads to find somebody that can really help you with the data that you have, to help you set up a robust sampling design and collect the data to actually answer your question, because that's what we want to know, right? We don't just want to be able to say that TNR works. We want to know how effective is it and how certain are we of that effectiveness, right? That's what we need to do to figure out if what we're doing is meeting the targets of what we're trying to do.
Thank you, Tyler. And again, that all aspects of the toolkit really just encourage a collaborative process and bringing in diverse voices and diverse skill sets. And that's really what it takes to make these projects successful. And this is such a wonderful foundation for providing folks with a guide for what are those different areas of expertise you could be looking out for to engage on your project. So I just want to remind everybody that we'll get to the Q&A in a minute. So if you have any questions, go ahead and put them in the Q&A. We're trying to make sure there's plenty of time for it. I already see we have a few coming in. But I do want to spend just a few minutes talking about the next phase that we've started of the DC Cat Count project, which is using the toolkit on some carefully selected implementation projects all around the country. And these sorry, that's like a tongue twister, isn't it? These implementation projects include communities with diverse range of project scope, diverse environments, and also a range in technical experience. And they're really helping us to even further refine the toolkit so we can make sure that it serves all communities and really reflect that any community, no matter what your resources, no matter what your technical experiences, can take on a project to count cats, another tongue twister. So, John, do you want to just start off with talking to us about some of these implementation projects and how they were selected, and what are we learning from them so far?
Sure. So creating the toolkit and making it available to everyone is part of trying to encourage the use of cat counting for all the reasons we've been describing. But we wanted to play a little bit more active role with some early adopters. The idea being that getting some actual examples out there of using cat counting in ways that are constructive and informative would do a couple of things. It would kind of create a clearer example to other potential adopters, and it would create some nodes of expertise in various organizations around the country, and perhaps even more broadly, who could then help to mentor other organizations to use these sorts of tools. So we selected several projects to work with in terms of these implementations, and they've ranged from fairly small to more ambitious. And in all cases, we're basically matching up their needs and their particular goals to the right parts of this toolkit and help them get started with their cat counting. So I think, maybe Margaret can give the best tangible example, since she's here on the call, since one of these projects involves her organization, and perhaps Danielle can do the same. But I would just say that I think everybody who's interested in this topic will, over the coming year or two, start to hear more about some projects that have incorporated these cat counting tools into their operation. And we're hopeful that it will create this broader interest and a clearer example that, hey, this is not only a potentially useful thing, but if that organization can do it, I think we can probably do it too. So with that, I turn it over to maybe Margaret and Danielle.
So the project I was talking about where we were counting cats to see how we were doing on our spay neuter is the project John mentioned. And we're really just getting that going. We just did our second count and we're really just ramping up our spay neuter right now. And we'll be excited to see what happens. And we're keeping close track of what are our lessons learned? What did we find out about when we counted the cats and how we did it, and with whom and how we tracked it. And so all of that, once we get up on top of the data and figure out if this is working or not, we'll be sharing through the ASPCAs and other venues, so that we'll be able to share our learnings with other folks interested.
Yeah, I don't have any specific updates to share at this point, but we'll encourage everyone to keep following along, and there will be some coming up in the next year or so. But I think one thing to point out at this time that could be really useful for organizations looking at this is, we're at a time in the country where we're experiencing a shortage of veterinarians, and those spay neuter surgeries are limited. And having a tool like this can really help an organization navigate through that and figuring out where to put those resources, how to make best use of those limited surgeries. So I think there are probably going to be a lot more projects that will be starting in the next 6 to 10 months. So please keep following the DC Cat Count for more updates.
Thank you. So I'll go ahead and jump into the Q&A. We've got quite a few. Danielle, maybe you can answer this first question. There's confusion between how we describe different cat populations. So stray cats, feral cats, community cats. Could you talk a little bit about those different definitions? And Tyler, feel free. I know that's something that we worked through in the data collection.
Yeah, that's a really tough one. We have a lot of different terms we use in our field, and often they're used differently by different people. And so I think what might help in this context is to understand how this particular project used some of those terms. For example, with the household surveys, with the ownership, I know there was a question there about the outdoor cats, the cats that were always outdoors versus the free roaming cats and a different and the camera traps. But for the household surveys, the questions were about people caring for cats. So that's really kind of can be a broad definition that includes both owned cats and cats that are being cared for by people who may or may not consider themselves owners, but it was cats that are being cared for. I think ownership is a really tough gray area, and you may have multiple people who consider themselves the owner of the same cat. And it can be a challenge when we're trying to collect data and for animal control and the shelter and other things. So it's we have to understand that these definitions are kind of the best that we have available. And that's why the project kind of looked at cats that are in the shelter, cats that are outdoors, and then the impressions of people and their relationship with the cats. So when we talk about the free roaming cats, so that 6,000, that is just a subset of all of those cats that were outdoors, but appear to be the ones that didn't have attachment to a caretaker. Stray cats tend to be just those that are wandering around, that have kind of mean, the technical definition of stray is that it's off someone's property. Whether that cat is feral or not, we don't know. That's another really difficult visual assessment to make. So I think, we use a lot of different terms, but the really important point here is that we have cats that are cared for outdoors, that have some connection with people. We have cats in the shelter, and then we have other cats that are outside that may not have a connection with people. I don't know if that helps or that just makes things more confusing. These are
No.
conversations that we continue to have in our field so that we have better terminology and that we use terms that are also better understood by the public.
Yes, that can be a whole separate community conversation, couldn't it? And just how we classify these cats. So Tyler, here's a question for you from Lauren. I own a nine-year-old indoor outdoor cat. How did you count DC owned cats? I didn't receive a survey about my cat, and neither did my neighbors who also own indoor cats. Did you gather this information from DC area veterinarians?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the answer to, did we gain it from veterinarians? The answer to that is no. We gathered this information by interviewing residents of Washington, D.C. Now, if you think about the US Census happens once every 10 years, and it censuses every household in the entire United States. That's a census. What they do in the intervening years is they actually get responses from a sample of the true population to figure out the directionality of different things. We did the same sort of idea. So instead of interviewing every household in Washington, D.C., we collected a representative sample of households from Washington, D.C. So that was about 2,600 responses. And then we use that data to estimate how many cats are owned at each household. And that's why when we produce these estimates, we have what's called a confidence interval or a certainty interval that says, here's our estimate of population size. So let's say 197,000 owned cats, but our confidence interval is that the true estimate is somewhere between, let's say 170 and 220. That's why when you see that sort of range, that's what it's accounting for, is that we take a sample of the true population and we can be 95% confident that the actual estimate is within that bound. And our best guess is that 197,000.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, we have so many good questions coming in. It's so hard to decide. Let's see. Someone asked about if for the camera traps, what other information about the cats were we able to capture in those traps, like their health condition, whether they were TNR'd and they had the ear tip. Were there any other details we were able to capture through the camera traps?
Yeah, that's a really good question too. So when we have these data collection efforts, we collect a lot of different data and then we use those data in different ways. So for each observation on the camera trap, we would record a certain number of things. So one of those things would be the coloration of the cat, the general health of that cat, whether it's ear tipped, the time that we saw it, whether it was interacting with other wildlife or whether it had kittens, the age of that cat. So there's a whole list of data that we collect. Now, one of the other questions that was asked is, how do you identify individuals? And to do that, what we do is we look through the photographs of cats and we match those that have unique coat patterns, right? So one of the challenges with cats is that there's lots of black cats, there's quite a few white cats that you can't tell as individuals, but those with really unique patterns, you can actually identify as individuals. And so this gets done a lot in wildlife ecology. That's why they can estimate the number of tigers, because they look at the unique stripe patterns. That's how they can estimate the number of whales, because they look at the exact patterns on the flukes of whales. And we're doing the same sort of thing with cats. The big challenge with cats, at least from a statistical standpoint, is that you have a lot of black cats and you have a lot of white cats and you can't tell them apart. So what this is known as is a partial identity model, which means that we can tell some of those individuals to individual level because they are unique. And then we have some that we can't, right? So the fact that there's these challenges is unique to cats, but there's models that help us to sort those factors out.
Thanks, Tyler. And I think Sam just put up the cat app developed in collaboration with the Smithsonian Conservation Biology Institute that can really further the understanding of being able to identify cats and for these kinds of counting efforts. So unfortunately, we are out of time. That was a lot to cover in an hour. But we first, thank you so much to all the panelists for making time to get together to talk about this exciting collaboration. And thank you for everybody that attended. We had a lot of people from all different sectors jump on, and thank you for your informed and interested questions. So we are recording this, and we will make this available to everyone as a recording for those who weren't able to join us. Have a good afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.